Great. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about how two incommensurable definitions of meritocracy draw people to draw illiberal policy conclusions from intelligence research and behavior genetic research findings. It will be no surprise to people here that intelligence research and behavior genetic research both bear closely on the meritocracy debate. Discussing the topic of meritocracy has been a regular feature of all the ISIR meetings that I've attended. Matt, who just presented, gave an opening lecture on meritocracy at ISIR 2022. Adrian Wooldridge gave a special presentation about his book, The Aristocracy of Talent, in 2021. And Abdul Abdullawi also gave a keynote presentation that same year on the genetics of socioeconomic status, which is the first sketch of a discussion piece he's just published in Nature Human Behavior. And of course, the debate about intelligence, genetics, and meritocracy goes back much further than this. So, a common definition of meritocracy is a society that rewards and promotes excellence. This is a pretty good definition, I think. And when it's described in this way, it's difficult for anyone to disagree with meritocracy as a political principle. Who doesn't want to live in a society where excellence is rewarded and promoted? But a critical question that people neglect to ask when conceiving of meritocracy this way is excellence according to whom? Who gets to decide what excellence is? And the answer to this question determines whether you're advocating for a liberal meritocracy or an authoritarian meritocracy. In an authoritarian meritocracy, an autocrat, a central planning committee, or a bureaucracy gets to decide what excellence is and imposes that hierarchy of value on society, sorting people into social strata based on their particular conception of what should and should not be rewarded and in what order. By contrast, in a liberal meritocracy, each individual person gets to decide what they think has value and which things have more value to them than others, with some people accruing more rewards than others by doing things other people value more. So it's common in these debates for people to talk about excellence as though it's an objective quality that everyone can recognize and agree on, something that can be readily assessed using an IQ test, a civil service exam, or apologetic score. But while there might be a lot of overlap in the things that people value, and many things that all else being equal, most people might prefer over others, such as being strong rather than weak, beautiful rather than ugly, rich rather than poor, etc. Typically, all else isn't equal, and different people will trade off different values in different ways. So, for example, many of you in this room will have traded off opportunities for more lucrative careers to pursue a career that you find more intellectually fulfilling. And this is something a free society allows us to do. The point is, there are as many hierarchies of value as there are human beings. Indifference to this question of who decides on what excellence or value is often leads scientists and commentators to conflate liberal and authoritarian meritocracies and to advocate implicitly or explicitly for technocratic social control. Thus, it's common to talk about the civil service in imperial China as one of the first meritocracies, embodying principles other societies should aspire to emulate. Here's an excerpt from Abdul's Nature Human Behavior paper, where he tries to draw a direct parallel between the downwardly imposed meritocratic system in imperial China with a completely different bottom-up one that emerged in commercial Western European society. It's also common to hear people describe contemporary China as an exemplary meritocracy because of its emphasis on examinations and performance for senior office. Here's a quote on screen from Matt's presentation in 2022. And here's also a quote from Adrian Wooldridge, where he does the same. Given Wooldridge thinks China is so great at meritocracy, and meritocracy is such a wonderful thing, one wonders why he thinks it would be such a bad thing if the West cedes the future to China. Wouldn't we all be better off if we were governed by the merit-loving officials from the PRC? Of course, Wooldridge doesn't want this, because he prefers a liberal democratic society to an authoritarian society. But by confusing the characteristics of an authoritarian meritocracy with those of a liberal free market society, he risks advocating that Western societies become less like themselves and more like China. Similarly, we often hear the British civil service exam after the Northcote-Trevelyan reforms held up as exemplifying the kind of meritocratic systems we should all be striving for. But here's the thing, society isn't a civil service. And I would argue we wouldn't want to live in a society in which government bureaucrats decided what they thought was socially valuable, assessed us against those criteria, and then sorted us into different positions of seniority and inferiority with different pay scales and privileges following from these positions. Let's not forget how arbitrary and divorced from reality, divorced from the actual needs of society, that the bureaucratic conception of merit can be. The civil service exam in Imperial China elevated people into senior administrative positions on the basis of things like their calligraphy skills, their ability to regurgitate classical Confucian texts by rote, or their ability to write formulaic moral essays that supported received opinion. The British civil service exams were much better, testing people on their mastery of Greek or Latin, or their proficiency in discussing art history, or famous literary works. People who advocate for technocratic meritocracy, or at least fail to distinguish it from liberal meritocracy, often misconstrue the nature of Michael Young's critique of meritocracy in the dystopian novel where he popularized the term. Young's dystopia is a society in which the entire social system is one gigantic civil service. This is how Young's narrator, reflecting on the beginnings of the meritocracy, opens the book. The flaw in the new competitive entry civil service was that the rest of society was not yet run on the civil service principle. Michael Young was a socialist, but the dystopia he imagined was not a free market system. In fact, salaries are equalized in Young's meritocracy, albeit with high status roles rewarded with extremely generous workplace benefits. Instead, Young's dystopia is an authoritarian technocracy, like the one in Brave New World, where a world controller presides over a vast bureaucracy stratified into 5 rigid cognitive castes, with alphas on the top and epsilons at the bottom. Abdullawi portrays the rise of the meritocracy as a dystopia because by selecting on innate talent, it eventually calcifies into a hereditary case system as rigid as the previous one based on hereditary privileges. But this was not the essence of Young's critique. Young's critique is that the bureaucrats saw people according to their narrow conception of value, and that the resultant hierarchy becomes conflated with some notion of moral superiority and inferiority because people come to believe they deserve their place in the social system. Having hopefully clarified the distinction between liberal and authoritarian meritocracy, I now want to turn to a different terminological confusion in this debate. As mentioned already, almost everyone who supports the idea of a meritocracy invokes the definition of a society that promotes excellence. But they often do so while advocating for completely different political objectives under the same banner. In particular, a very common definition of meritocracy is a society which promotes equality of environmental opportunity. That is, a society which tries to ensure that everyone has equal prospects regardless of the arbitrary circumstances of their birth. But a moment's reflection should reveal that this is a completely different political principle to the first definition of meritocracy. If we want a society that rewards excellence, why would we only reward excellence that is genetic rather than environmental in origin? This is not what people spontaneously do in a free society, where we value certain goods and services based on how much we like them and how much we're willing to pay for them, irrespective of the degree to which the actions that produce them were under genetic or environmental influence. And even if we did, that would only alter our own valuations, and we wouldn't be able to coerce others into making similar judgments. When conceived as the systematic equalization of environmental advantages, equality of opportunity is only a goal that coercive, technocratic meritocracies can pursue. But on what moral basis would technocratic meritocracies pursue this goal? It's true that no one deserves the environmental advantages of being born to rich or educated parents, but no one deserves their genetic advantages either, as both Hayek and Rawls have highlighted. It's remarkable how widely this simple point is overlooked in social science genetics, where equalizing environmental opportunities is an almost universally accepted political goal, as well as in much of wider society. In the conventional, genetically confounded social sciences, researchers have been churning out papers for over 60 years in which the correlations between first-degree relatives for socioeconomic outcomes have been used as a direct measure of equality of opportunity, and in which policymakers have been repeatedly hectored to implement policies which reduce the socioeconomic resemblance between parents and children. As social science genetics has developed as a field, the same political objective has largely been retained, while accepting that there might be a substantially smaller role for environmental transmission of advantage after genetics are taken into account. However, an underappreciated implication of this project of eliminating environmental advantages while tolerating genetic ones is that it implies a eugenic meritocracy, in which people are sorted into social strata based on genetic differences in ability, just like the hereditary meritocracy in Michael Young's satire. This implication was also noted by Richard Herrnstein in his infamous 1971 article, IQ, in The Atlantic. It can be quite amusing to occasionally see progressive social science geneticists stumble into the awkward realization that their cherished political project of eliminating undeserved environmental sources of inequality implies the eugenic stratification of society along genetic lines. Take this 2015 paper, authored by a veritable who's who of names in contemporary social science genetics. After making the usual bromides about social mobility and equality of opportunity, it contains this striking passage, and I'll just read you the highlights. Fundamentally unjust societies are evidenced by low heritability estimates. A meritocratic society will display a high genetic component to achieved social position. And my personal favorite, policy should aim to enhance sorting on innate characteristics. There's an endnote associated with this passage where the authors seem to balk at their own conclusions, writing, but this line of argument conflates genetics with merit. But instead of grappling with this troublesome implication and reconsidering the eugenic logic of enforced equalization of environmental opportunities, they blow smoke about genetic influences on a trait not necessarily suggesting merit, because they potentially reflect societal prejudices against people with irrelevant heritable characteristics, what we sometimes call redhead effects in behavioral genetics after a famous thought experiment. But note, this argument effectively concedes that to the extent that genetic effects aren't redhead effects, they are a measure of merit. There is a different sense in which equality of opportunity can be salvaged as a philosophically defensible principle consistent with liberal meritocracy. And that's the sense in which everyone should be afforded the chance to try to demonstrate their value to society and should not have discriminatory legal barriers or other obstacles deliberately placed in their path by others. But this is an entirely different proposition from suggesting that children should not be allowed to benefit from the skills or resources of their parents, that people with certain environmental advantages should be handicapped, or that everyone who had environmental disadvantages should be given a head start in every competition. This discriminatory version of equality of opportunity is the complete opposite of equality of opportunity in the liberal meritocratic sense. But this discriminatory version is the definition that prevails in the social sciences and in the wider meritocracy debate, all while borrowing the positive connotations of the liberal idea. As Hayek pointed out, when equality of opportunity is construed as eliminating undeserved environmental differences between people, it produces an authoritarian nightmare because it invites government technocrats to control every aspect of our lives to ensure that we all have the same prospects. In fact, it collapses into the very thing that equality of opportunity advocates try to contrast their position with, the authoritarian anti-meritocratic agenda of the equity movement. Here are some remarks on Twitter by the venture capitalists Eric Torenberg and Nate Fisher from earlier this year, where they tease out that implication, rediscovering Hayek's logic in the current political context. And I'm going to flash a lot of longer quotes up on the screen. You just trust what I'm saying if you don't have a chance to read. You can look up the slides later, I can share them. And of course, the most extreme implication of the equalizing environments agenda is that it requires the abolition of the family, something Rawls recognized, and something that has been advocated by a long line of socialist thinkers going back to Charles Fourier. As unpalatable as that implication might seem, several communist societies have been prepared to bite that bullet and separate children from their parents in, for example, communist Russia, China, and Cambodia. But proponents of equality of environmental opportunity say that they don't want to take things that far, but they fail to explain why the principle should stop at the family rather than somewhere else. To them, I'm inclined to say, if the rule you followed brought you to this, of what use was the rule? In any case, as I've tried to show, there is simply no ethical basis for preferring genetic sources of advantage over environmental ones. In this regard, those expanding the equity agenda to ameliorate genetic as well as environmental sources of social inequality, or simply calling for total equality of outcome, are actually more philosophically consistent than the equality of environmental opportunity proponents. So from the realization that no one deserves their genetic and environmental good fortune, Rawls and Hayek both reached the conclusion that rewarding people on the basis of desert, which they essentially interpret as well-meaning effort, is infeasible. Rawls, who constantly flirts with free will skepticism, suggests it's infeasible because even effort is based on undeserved genetic and environmental causes, basically implying that nothing is really deserved. Hayek, on the other hand, suggests it's infeasible because none of us are omniscient, none of us are gods who know everyone's potential and whether they have lived up to it. In any event, Hayek persuasively argues that our notions of excellence and utility are largely independent of the idea of moral creditworthiness or desert, and that the debate about meritocracy and distributive justice has been deeply confused by conflating these two distinct meanings of the word merit. Desert or moral merit is just one species of value among many. And this is nicely exemplified by physical beauty, which we clearly value despite the fact that people can obviously claim no credit for their physical attractiveness. The demand that we only value what is deserved would lead to the nihilistic extinction of most of the things that we value. Moreover, Hayek points out that even if we could somehow reward everyone on the basis of their moral creditworthiness, it would be unwise for us to do so. Because if we rewarded people merely for valiantly trying to do things that they believed were valuable, rather than for actually delivering results that other people valued, that incentive structure would fail to encourage them to direct their efforts where they're more useful. The recognition that people can provide value to their fellows by cultivating their talents, despite the fact that their talents are undeserved, leads both Hayek and Rawls to argue that it is self-destructive for a society to thwart our spontaneous attempts to reward people for what we value, because producing more of what other people value is precisely what prosperity entails. We often see social science geneticists enlist a version of this argument as a get-out-of-jail card to explain why they tolerate genetic sources of inequality. But of course, that argument doesn't only apply to genetic differences in ability, but applies to socially transmitted sources of inequality too. This is a point I tried to make somewhat clumsily in my remarks in the Q&A after Matt's Meritocracy presentation at ISIR 2023. And if you jump to the end of that video, which is on the ISIR website, you can hear me ask it. But here's Hayek saying it a little more elegantly than I could manage. It is difficult to see why the same useful quality which is welcomed when it is the result of a person's natural endowment should be less valuable when it is the product of such circumstances as intelligent parents or a good home. Moreover, there is no greater injustice involved in some people being born to wealthy parents than there is in others being born to kind or intelligent parents. The fact is that it is no less of an advantage to the community if at least some children can start with the advantages which at any given time only wealthy homes can offer, than if some children inherit great intelligence or are taught better morals at home. So here we see Hayek flip the logic used by Hardin and de Boer completely on its head. Whereas those authors argue we should reduce the benefits that accrue to people as a result of their genetic advantages on the basis that these are no more deserved than environmental advantages, Hayek argues that we should tolerate inequalities arising from environmental advantages just as we do genetic ones, because we value things independently of their moral creditworthiness. We live in an information environment in which we are constantly bombarded with the idea that environmental advantages are unjust and that equalizing environments is an obvious and universal political goal. It can therefore be quite jarring to discover that these arguments are philosophically contentious and poorly justified. It certainly was for me as someone who previously subscribed to this view and took it for granted that all right-thinking people felt the same. Let me try and leave you with a couple of final thoughts. There is a concept that Hayek first put forward in The Road to Serfdom, which still hasn't widely been picked up, which is that there are two kinds of socialism: the equality-oriented socialism of the left and the inegalitarian hierarchical socialism of the right, and that both conceptions are equally inimical to individual liberty. I'm basically trying to make the same point by highlighting how authoritarian meritocracy is just as inimical to liberal meritocracy as authoritarian egalitarianism, and should not be confused with it. In fact, an egalitarian technocracy, which imposes a flat hierarchy of value, is just a special case of a meritocratic technocracy imposing its hierarchy of values on everybody else. Both are the opposite of a free society. There is only one kind of equality that is compatible with liberal meritocracy, and that is equal treatment before the law and equal treatment based on your manifest conduct. You can either have a moral and legal system which treats everyone equally based on what they do, accepting that some people will fare better in that regime than others, or you can have a system that treats people unequally based on who they are, and which seeks to ensure that people with vastly different abilities and preferences achieve similar outcomes. You cannot have both, and only one of these is compatible with freedom. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Damien. Any questions? No questions? Oh.
Hello, great talk. You did a good job at sort of attacking the notion that merit is synonymous with genetic talent or high polygenic score, but I don't really understand what the alternative is. So merit, I suppose you define whatever the free market wants, right? You mentioned that in China it was considered meritorious to be good at calligraphy, or in the Old West to be proficient in Greek, which I agree with. But in our society, for example, rewards Kim Kardashian as meritorious. So that's the outcome of the free market, which I don't even know if it's free, because often it's coordinated. I was just saying that whatever the free market rewards is not necessarily what's good for society.
Who decides what's good for society?
Well, it could be a centralized system, as in China and as in other successful societies. So how would you the question is, how do you define merit? And second, if we follow your idea to its conclusion, should we do away with all kinds of redistribution or all kinds of socially supportive policies?
Thanks for the question, Alex. I think the first point is just to really highlight the distinction that both Hayek, people forget this, but Rawls as well. Hayek and Rawls both make this fundamental distinction between the value that you bring to society and your moral desert. So, I think we just firstly need to dispense with the idea at all that those things are in any way related. The only if you want to relate those two things, the only philosophically defensible response is to support equality of outcome, because nothing is deserved. So, if you're gonna link those two ideas, you're kind of boxed in. But two quite different, very respected political philosophers have come to the conclusion that we need to separate these two things, because otherwise we're just all going to be totally impoverished. Everything we value is going to, we're not going to be allowed to value anything we want to, because hardly anything is deserved. So that's the first point. But to get to your second question, what do I consider merit? The whole point is it's not about what any one person considers merit. And I want to also highlight, it's not about the free market. This is also, people mischaracterize Hayek as someone saying the free market should decide what value is. The free market decides what economic value is, but a liberal meritocratic society means if I really like Kim Kardashian, who are you to tell me that it's wrong for me to like Kim Kardashian? I might not pay Kim Kardashian money. I might not buy her video game, but I can choose my own value system. And if enough people all agree that they really like Kim Kardashian, they can watch her show and that gets good ratings and she gets income from that, and more power to her. You had a last part about redistribution. I don't think it blocks all, the principles I'm talking about block all kinds of redistribution. Hayek favored some level of redistribution, but the point of redistribution was not for Hayek at least, it's different for Rawls. For Hayek, it was not redistribution to reduce inequality. It was to reduce suffering. So you're not trying to bring everyone closer together. You're lifting the bottom up, and the top can go as high as it goes. But it's about alleviating suffering rather than reducing inequality, because inequality is undeserved. That's a different moral logic.
All right. Thank you, Damien.
Thank you.